The first snowfall of winter came early that year, covering the small wooden cabins of the valley in a quiet blanket of white. Smoke curled gently from the chimneys as the sun sank behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. It was the kind of evening that made folks gather close to their fires, hold their children near, and whisper prayers that the harsh season ahead would be kind. But for one poor widow living on the edge of that little village, kindness had been a stranger for far too long. Her husband had been gone 2 winters now, taken by fever that no doctor or prayer could cure. Since then, she'd learned to chop her own wood, mend her own fences, and keep her children alive on what little the earth and her weary hands could offer. Her small homestead stood apart from the others, a weathered cabin surrounded by a frozen field that once grew corn and barley. Every morning before dawn, she would rise to light the stove, wrap her shawl tight, and wake her 2 children. Together they would tend to the chickens, patch leaks in the roof, and haul water from the creek that cut through the pine forest. The village folks rarely visited anymore, some out of pity, others out of superstition. They said misfortune followed her since the day her husband died, and no one wanted to catch its shadow. Still, she bore it all with quiet grace, her eyes tired yet tender whenever she looked at her children. That evening, the wind picked up from the mountains, howling like some lonely spirit lost among the ridges. She was preparing supper, thin broth and stale bread, when her boy rushed in, cheeks red, breath clouding the air. "Ma," he gasped, "there's someone out by the creek. I think he's hurt bad." Her heart tightened. In those parts, strangers often meant trouble. Bandits, trappers, sometimes even bounty hunters passing through. But when she stepped outside, following her son's trembling hand toward the dark tree line, something in the stillness pulled her forward. The snow was stained with blood, a faint trail leading down the embankment. She told her children to stay near the lantern light and ventured ahead, the cold biting at her face as she knelt beside a fallen figure half buried in the snow. He wasn't dead, but close to it. His chest rose shallowly, breath rattling through cracked lips. His skin was sunburnt and marked with dirt and ash, his hair long and black as midnight, braided with small beads and feathers. His arm bore a deep wound, and his clothes were torn from travel and battle. Even before she noticed the faint tribal markings on his neck, she knew what he was: Apache, one of the native warriors the settlers feared. The kind whispered about around campfires as raiders or ghosts of vengeance. Her first thought was to leave him. No one would blame her. Harboring an Apache could bring soldiers or worse. But as the man's head turned slightly, and she saw the faint flicker of life still fighting inside him, her heart betrayed her reason. The widow hurried back to the cabin and called for her children. "Bring blankets," she said, "and boil more water." The boy hesitated, his small sister clutching his arm. "Ma, folks say they kill people." She met his frightened eyes with calm resolve. "He's dying," she said softly, "and no one deserves to die out here alone." Together they dragged the wounded man inside, laying him near the fire. His body was cold as stone, his pulse faint but steady. She cleaned his wounds carefully, tearing one of her few good linens to bind his arm. He stirred once, his eyes opening just enough for her to see their color. Dark, fierce, yet weary, like someone who had seen too much of both war and pain. Then he slipped into unconsciousness again, leaving her with more questions than answers. Through the long night she sat by his side, feeding the fire and watching him breathe. Every sound outside made her flinch, the crunch of snow, the cry of wolves in the distance. The world beyond those cabin walls was dangerous enough for her family, without adding an enemy of the white settlers under her roof. Yet something about the man's face, the lines etched by struggle and solitude, spoke to her. He looked like someone who had carried his own share of loss. She thought of her husband's final days, how she had sat helpless beside him as his strength faded away. Maybe saving this stranger was her way of fighting back against that memory, a small act of mercy in a world that had shown her little of it. By morning, his fever had broken slightly. The children watched from the corner as their mother spooned broth between his lips. The little girl whispered, "He looks like a warrior, Ma." The widow nodded, her gaze distant. "He is." She didn't tell them that warriors brought danger, that the army hunted men like him. She didn't tell them that if anyone in the village found out, they could lose everything: their home, their safety, maybe even their lives. Instead, she kept her focus on the man's breathing, counting each rise and fall as if it were a fragile promise. As the days passed, the snow deepened and the world shrank to the small circle of light within that cabin. The stranger began to heal slowly, his strength returning bit by bit. He spoke little, his voice low and rough when he did. The children were curious, sneaking glances at his tattoos and the strange ornaments he carried, a small pouch of stones, a feather tied to his wrist. He watched them with quiet eyes, never harsh, never unkind. There was a stillness about him, a kind of discipline born from years of survival. When he finally thanked the widow in broken English, she felt something shift inside her, something that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Outside, rumors were already stirring in the nearby town. A patrol of soldiers had been seen searching the valley, following signs of an Apache escapee, one who'd been wounded in a clash near the border. The widow heard the news from a passing peddler and felt her blood run cold. She returned home that evening and found the warrior sitting upright, sharpening a piece of metal into a blade. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. He knew she had heard. She knew he would have to leave. But when she opened her mouth to tell him, her daughter appeared at the doorway holding the warrior's old pouch. "He made me a necklace," the girl said proudly. The widow froze, caught between fear and gratitude. That night, as the wind rattled the cabin shutters and the fire dimmed, she sat awake long after her children had fallen asleep. The Apache lay quietly on the floor beside the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flickering light. "Why did you save me?" he asked suddenly. His voice was gentle, but his words carried a weight she could feel in her bones. She didn't answer right away. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe because she had seen too much death, or maybe because she believed in some quiet corner of her soul that mercy still mattered. When she finally spoke, her words trembled. "Because someone once saved me." He turned his head slightly, the firelight catching the scar along his jaw. "Then you have changed what would have been my fate," he said, almost like a vow. The air grew heavy between them, the sound of the storm outside muffling everything else. She knew the soldiers would come soon. She knew her act of kindness could destroy the fragile world she'd built for her children. But as the man's eyes met hers, dark, steady, unafraid, she felt something awaken that had been buried with her husband's passing, a spark of life, of defiance, of fate intertwining where it shouldn't. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, a poor widow and her children sheltered a dying Apache warrior, unaware that by saving him, they had just changed the course of all their lives forever. The days that followed were restless, marked by a silence that seemed heavier than the snow pressing on the roof. Each morning, the widow would wake before dawn, tend to the stove, and listen for sounds beyond the cabin walls. The world outside had turned cold and white, yet it wasn't the winter that chilled her most. It was the fear of what might come riding through those woods. Every creak of the old timber, every echoing hoofbeat from the valley made her heart race. The Apache still rested by the fire, his wounds healing, but his presence a constant reminder that she had crossed a line she couldn't undo. She didn't even know his name, yet his presence filled the cabin like a shadow stretching through every room. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a calm gravity that unsettled her. His English was broken, but his eyes, those sharp, steady eyes, spoke a language she somehow understood. He helped her children with small chores, cutting wood, repairing a loose shutter, or mending the broken handle of a water pail. Her boy began to follow him outside, curious about the way he moved so quietly through the snow, how he seemed to listen to the world instead of merely seeing it. The warrior would kneel and show him tracks, rabbit, deer, even fox, explaining with gestures and soft words how to tell one from another. The boy watched in awe while his mother watched from the doorway, torn between fear and a strange, growing sense of trust. At night, when the children were asleep, she often found herself sitting across from the warrior by the fire, the flickering light throwing long shadows across his face. She wanted to ask about his people, his journey, the scar on his arm that looked older than the rest. But each time she tried, something held her back. He seemed to carry the weight of a world she couldn't reach, a world carved from mountains, rivers, and loss. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he would take out a small wooden carving shaped like a bird and stare at it for a long time. She realized it was a symbol of something sacred to him, something he couldn't leave behind even in his suffering. The children grew used to him quickly, especially the little girl, who would hum songs while brushing his long black hair near the fire. She had no fear, only innocence, asking questions that made her mother's heart ache. "Does he have a family too, Ma?" the girl asked once, her eyes full of curiosity. The widow hesitated, glancing toward the warrior as he repaired one of her husband's old traps. "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe he lost them like we did." The girl nodded, as if that answer made sense, and went back to her humming. but the outside world was closing in. Word had spread in town about an Apache survivor. A group of soldiers from Fort Stockton had been seen asking questions, showing a sketch to anyone who'd listen. Some men claimed the warrior was dangerous, that he had killed settlers and fled north. Others swore they'd seen his tracks near the river, though snow had long since covered any proof. The widow knew it was only a matter of time before those rumors found their way up to her lonely cabin. She thought of sending him away, but each time she looked at him, weak, scarred, still struggling to regain his full strength, she couldn't bring herself to speak the words. One afternoon, while chopping wood, she heard the distant rumble of horses. Her heart leapt into her throat. She motioned for the warrior to stay inside and ran to the clearing. 2 riders approached, wrapped in long coats, rifles hanging from their saddles. She recognized one of them, a trader who sometimes passed by to sell salt and cloth. "Afternoon, ma'am," he greeted, his breath visible in the cold air. "We're just checking up on folks. Soldiers came through town yesterday. They say an Apache's loose in these parts." She forced a polite smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "I haven't seen anyone. Just trying to keep my children warm." The men nodded, though one's eyes lingered on her cabin longer than she liked. When they finally rode off, she felt her knees weaken. That night she told the warrior about it. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable. "They hunt," he said finally. "Always hunt." His tone wasn't bitter, just certain, like someone who had lived his whole life under that truth. She studied him, the flicker of the fire reflecting in his eyes. "Why were they after you?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then looked away. "They killed my brother. Took him from our land. I went to bring him home." His hand clenched around the wooden bird, and for the first time she saw the pain behind his calm. It wasn't just the pain of loss. It was the pain of carrying the weight of something sacred broken by others. Days turned into weeks. The snow began to thaw, the first hints of spring creeping through the pines. The widow started to notice how the air felt different when he was near, how the silence between them no longer felt heavy, but alive. She still feared what would happen if he was discovered, yet that fear began to mingle with something else, something that frightened her even more. It was in the way he would lift heavy logs for her without being asked, or the quiet patience in his eyes when her children laughed around him. There was a strength about him, not just in his body, but in his spirit. It made her wonder if God had sent him here not as a burden, but as a test. One evening, when the sky burned orange with sunset, she found him standing near the creek, his reflection trembling in the icy water. "You should go soon," she said quietly, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "If they find you here, they'll take everything from us." He turned to face her, his long braid falling over his shoulder. "You saved my life," he said. "Now I save yours," the words startled her. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the horizon. "The soldiers, they come again. I saw smoke by the ridge." Fear washed over her. "You can't stay," she whispered. "If they find you, they'll burn this place down." He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the dimming light. "You and your children," he said slowly. "You gave me life when I was already gone. My people believe that when one's spirit is returned, it must protect the hands that gave it back." She didn't know what to say. Something in his tone sounded like a vow. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the wind quiet, the water still. The sound of a child's laughter drifted from the cabin, fragile and distant. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the faint crack of branches outside, the whisper of snow shifting under weight. The warrior was awake too, sitting near the window, his eyes scanning the dark. Just before dawn they both heard it, the faint echo of horses approaching from the valley. He stood, his body tense, his gaze sharp as a blade. "They come," he said. She rushed to the children's room, heart pounding. "Get up," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to go." But before they could move, there was a knock at the door. The widow froze. The warrior looked at her, silent but steady, then reached for the knife he'd kept hidden beneath the floorboard. "No," she whispered urgently. "You can't fight them here." He shook his head. "If I leave, they take you." His words were quiet but final. The pounding grew louder, and a rough voice called out, "Open up, miss. Army patrol. We need to ask a few questions." She felt the walls closing in, her mind racing. If they searched the cabin, they'd find him. If she refused, they'd force their way in. With shaking hands, she opened the door slightly. 2 soldiers stood there, faces cold, eyes suspicious. "Evening, ma'am," one said. "We're looking for a fugitive. Apache man. Might be hurt. You seen anything? She forced herself to meet his gaze. No, sir. Just me and my children here. The man's eyes drifted past her shoulder, scanning the dim interior. You live alone way out here? He asked. Yes, she said softly. My husband passed. The other soldier stepped closer, peering inside. Her pulse hammered in her throat. Behind her, the fire crackled, and then from the shadows a faint creak of floorboards. The first soldier's hand moved to his rifle. Who's that? He barked. Before she could speak, the warrior emerged from the corner, standing tall, his eyes calm but unyielding. The soldiers froze, shock flashing across their faces. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air was thick with dread and something else, resolve. The widow's breath caught as she stepped between them, her arms spread. Please, she pleaded. He's not your enemy. But the soldiers raised their guns, their voices sharp and cold. The warrior didn't flinch. His gaze locked on hers, a silent message passing between them. Something deeper than words, something that would shape everything to come. Then, with a voice steady as stone, he said, You saved me once. Now let me return it. Outside, the wind howled across the valley, carrying with it the first light of dawn. Inside that small cabin, time stood still, caught between mercy and survival, between a widow's fragile hope and a warrior's unspoken promise. None of them knew that by sunrise, the valley would no longer be the same, and the lives within that little cabin on the edge of the world would be forever bound by what was about to happen next. The standoff in the cabin felt like a lifetime compressed into a few heartbeats. The warrior's hand hovered near his knife. The soldiers' rifles gleamed in the firelight, and the widow stood between them all, her breath shallow, her mind screaming for a way to stop what was coming. One wrong move and everything she had left, her children, her home, her fragile peace, would be lost to blood and fire. The wind outside wailed through the cracks in the wood, a mournful cry that matched the fear twisting in her chest. The taller soldier took a step forward, his voice sharp. Ma'am, move aside. That man's wanted for murder. She shook her head, her palms trembling. He's no murderer. He was dying when we found him. He hasn't hurt anyone. The soldier's eyes narrowed. You don't know what he's done. The warrior's gaze didn't shift, his stance calm but coiled. He didn't seem afraid, only ready, as though he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Before the tension could break, the door burst open again and a blast of icy wind swept in, scattering embers from the hearth. The children cried out. The warrior's knife flashed in the dim light, but then a distant shout echoed from the trees outside. Another voice urgent. They're here! Tracks lead to the ridge. The two soldiers turned instinctively toward the sound. The warrior seized the moment, grabbing the widow by the arm and pulling her toward the back door. She didn't even have time to protest. He moved with a silent precision, guiding her and the children through the narrow back room and out into the night. The cold hit her like a slap, but fear drove her faster than the wind. They stumbled through the snow, following the warrior into the dark woods behind the cabin. Branches whipped her face, her shawl caught on thorns, but she didn't dare stop. The children clung to her skirts, whimpering, and the warrior led them wordlessly, his movements sure even in the shadows. Behind them, she could hear the soldiers shouting, dogs barking, boots crunching over the snow. The hunt had begun. By dawn, they had crossed the ridge and reached the edge of an old abandoned mine, the same one her late husband had once worked before the fever took him. The widow knew this place too well, its tunnels winding like veins through the frozen earth. The warrior motioned for silence, then led them inside, where the cold air turned damp and heavy. The children huddled together, frightened and shivering. She turned to the warrior, her voice barely a whisper. They'll find us. They always do. He met her eyes. Not here, he said simply. This place remembers my people. Hours passed as they hid in the darkness. The widow's mind ran wild with questions. Who was he really? Why had he risked everything to stay near them? She remembered the way he'd spoken the night before, the vow he'd made to protect them, and a part of her wanted to believe it. But another part, the one hardened by loss and survival, whispered that no one stayed. Everyone she had ever loved had been taken by fate or by men with guns. In the dim light, she watched him tend to his knife, sharpening it with slow, deliberate strokes. His calm unnerved her. You should have left me, she said quietly. If you're caught, they'll kill you and us with you. He stopped, looking up. I know, he said, but I owe you my breath. My spirit is tied to yours now. She didn't understand, but something in his tone made her heart tighten. Outside, the soldiers searched for days. The valley filled with smoke as they burned empty barns and questioned every family within miles. Rumors spread through the nearby town. Some said the widow had run off with the Apache, others claimed he had taken her by force. Her few remaining friends turned their faces away when her name was mentioned. But one man, the local sheriff, refused to believe the worst. He had known her husband, respected the family's quiet strength, and couldn't reconcile the gossip with the woman he remembered. He organized a search party, not to arrest her, but to bring her and her children home safely. Yet in doing so, he unwittingly joined the same path that would soon lead all of them into danger. Inside the mine, time lost its meaning. The widow tried to keep her children's spirits up, telling them stories by the faint light of the fire the warrior built with bits of dry wood. She noticed how he always sat near the entrance, listening to the wind, every sense alert. Sometimes he would vanish for hours and return with food, small rabbits, roots, even a handful of berries from the low valley. Her boy began following him, learning to track quietly, to listen for danger. She wanted to stop him, to keep him close. But when she saw how proud he looked returning with his small catches, she couldn't. For the first time since her husband's death, her son was learning strength not from fear but from example. One evening, when the storm outside finally began to ease, the warrior shared more of his story. He spoke of a battle, one that wasn't meant to happen. His people had been defending their land when soldiers came without warning. His brother had been taken prisoner. The warrior tried to rescue him, but the mission failed, and he was hunted ever since. "They say we are savages," he said, his voice low. "But we only fight when our dead are not allowed to rest." The widow listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She saw the pain in his eyes, the kind that mirrored her own, the kind that comes from losing more than one can ever replace. As he spoke, a small flicker of understanding passed between them. The world had made them both outcasts in different ways, she for being poor and widowed, he for being born into a world that feared his kind. Yet both had learned to survive by sheer will. It was a quiet connection, one neither dared to name, but it grew stronger with every shared look, every silent moment of trust. But peace, as she knew too well, never lasted long. Late one night, the warrior returned from scouting with a grim expression. "They are close," he said. "The soldiers. And not just them." He mentioned another group. Hunters, settlers from the next town, paid to track him down. They carried torches, guns, and hatred. The widow's blood turned cold. "Then we have to run again," she said. But he shook his head. "If we run, they find us. If we stay, they come." His voice was calm, but his eyes carried something darker, a readiness for what must come next. She could feel the walls of fate closing in, the same suffocating feeling she'd known when she watched her husband fade from life. This time, though, she wasn't ready to lose again. "There has to be another way," she whispered. The warrior looked toward her children, sleeping beside the faint fire. "There is," he said, "but it will cost more than you want to give." She didn't understand what he meant until morning, when she woke to find him gone. His footprints led out of the mine, heading toward the valley, the same direction where the smoke of campfires rose. Panic gripped her. She woke her son, told him to stay hidden, and followed the tracks as far as she could. From a distance, she saw the outline of the soldiers near the creek, and among them, the warrior, standing alone, unarmed, his hands raised. Her heart dropped. He wasn't running, he was surrendering. She wanted to scream, but fear locked her throat. Through the drifting mist, she could hear one soldier shouting orders, and then the unmistakable sound of struggle. Shouts, boots stomping, the clash of metal. A gunshot cracked through the air, then another. She stumbled backward, covering her mouth, tears freezing on her cheeks. She couldn't tell what had happened, whether he was dead or alive, but one thing was certain. The world had found them again. When she returned to the mine, her children were awake, confused and frightened. She held them close, her mind racing. She didn't know what would come next, whether the soldiers would return for them, or whether the warrior's sacrifice had bought them another day. All she knew was that the stillness of the valley felt wrong, like the quiet before a storm. As night fell, she sat by the dying fire, staring at the small wooden bird he had left behind. It was carved smooth, shaped with care, a symbol of something she didn't yet understand. She held it close to her heart, feeling the faint warmth, still trapped in its surface, as though a piece of his spirit lingered within it. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, and the moon rose cold and pale over the mountains. The widow didn't know that this night, this silence, was only the calm before everything would break. The world she thought she knew was about to change again, and the man she feared was gone might yet return, not as the hunted, but as something far greater and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The morning after the gunfire, the valley lay in an eerie stillness. Frost clung to every branch and stone, and even the birds seemed afraid to break the silence. The widow stood at the mouth of the mine, her shawl drawn tight, staring into the empty horizon where the Apache warrior had vanished. Her children slept behind her, unaware of what she had seen. The flash of rifles, the sound of his body hitting the frozen earth. Every sound since then had haunted her, the echo of his voice, the promise he made before leaving. She wanted to believe he had survived, but the stillness of the land felt like a warning. She spent the next days keeping the children hidden, feeding them from what little was left and listening for approaching riders. But the quiet was deceptive. The soldier patrols grew more frequent. She saw their smoke from the ridges at night, and the dogs' howls carried across the valley like a grim song. Once, near dusk, she heard a man's voice calling from the distance, low, commanding, too familiar to ignore. She froze, holding her breath. Then, faintly through the snowstorm, came the sound of her name being shouted. It was the sheriff. Her relief was short-lived. The sheriff was known for fairness, but he rode with men loyal to the army now, men who'd been ordered to hunt. She couldn't risk being found, not until she knew what had become of the Apache. When the sound of hooves came closer, she hurried her children deeper into the mine, wrapping them in old blankets. No sound, she whispered. No matter what you hear. The fear in her boy's eyes broke her heart, but she had no time for comfort. Outside, voices echoed. She crouched behind a boulder near the entrance and watched as 3 riders appeared through the trees. The sheriff dismounted first, scanning the ground. Tracks, he said to his men. Small ones, children maybe. She's close. One of the soldiers spat into the snow. And the Indian? The sheriff's tone darkened. If he's alive, he won't be for long. They say he took a bullet near the shoulder, but no one found a body. Her heart thudded in her chest. Alive. The word hit her like a spark. She pressed her hand against the cold rock, her mind torn between fear and hope. If he was alive, then maybe there was still a chance. But if the soldiers found her first, that chance would vanish. She waited until the men moved on, their voices fading into the forest, before returning to her children. We'll leave tonight, she whispered. Before the moon rises. When night came, the sky was clear and the snow gleamed under the starlight. She carried her daughter in her arms while her son walked beside her, clutching the small wooden bird the Apache had carved. The air was so still she could hear their breaths and the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Every step took them farther, from the mine, deeper into the valley toward the river where the land curved south. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move. The sound of movement came before she saw the fire. It flickered faintly between the trees ahead, too small to be a soldier's camp. She hesitated, her hand instinctively reaching for her son's arm. Then from the shadows, a figure stepped into the light. Her breath caught. He stood tall despite the bandage across his shoulder, his long black hair unbound, his eyes burning with something fierce and alive. It was him, the Apache warrior. He moved toward her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish like a dream. The children rushed to him first, their cries echoing softly through the cold. He knelt, resting a hand gently on each of their heads before looking up at her. They think you dead, she whispered, her voice breaking. He shook his head. They wanted me dead. I made them believe. She wanted to ask how, but the look in his eyes told her not to. He had seen things no words could describe. They made camp by the river that night, hidden beneath the trees. The warrior spoke little, but his presence steadied her in a way nothing else could. He told her the soldiers had split their forces, half searching north, half moving east toward the settlements. They burn what they cannot find, he said. They will burn your cabin. Her chest tightened. Everything I had is there. He looked into the fire. You have more now. You have life. As dawn approached, they planned their next move. He wanted to lead them west, toward the mountains where no patrol would dare follow. The journey would be harsh, but it was the only way. She hesitated. We can't live like fugitives, she said quietly. The children. He cut her off gently. If we stay, they die. If we go, they live. There was no cruelty in his tone, only truth. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and cold. They moved at dawn and rested by night, surviving on what little the land offered. The warrior's strength returned, though his wound bled whenever he pushed too far. He hid it well, never letting the children see his pain. The widow often caught herself watching him, how he moved through the wilderness like he belonged to it, how his presence seemed to calm even the animals. There was a quiet nobility in him, something she had never seen in any man before. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, they reached an open meadow where the snow had begun to melt. The world was silent except for the crackle of the fire they built. The widow sat beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter. Do you ever wish things were different? She asked softly. He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Different? His voice was distant. If they were different, you would not have found me. I would be dead. His words sank deep into her chest. She didn't respond. They were close now. Too close to the mountains for comfort. The warrior knew the land well, but he also knew the soldiers would not stop. The army had been humiliated once before. They would not allow an Apache to vanish with a settler woman. Their pride would not forgive it. That night, as the children slept, he sat alone, sharpening his blade. The widow approached quietly, her breath visible in the cold air. You can't fight them all, she said. You'll die if you try. He didn't look at her. Then, I die with honor. The sharp edge of his words cut through her. And what about us? She asked, her voice trembling. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and steady. I protect what I owe, even if I must die to do it. The firelight danced between them, casting their shadows together on the snow. She wanted to argue, to make him promise that he would stay, but deep down, she knew he couldn't. Some men were born to fight for something larger than themselves, and he was one of them. Before dawn, the sound of horses shattered the quiet. She woke to the warrior's hand on her shoulder. They found us, he whispered. She grabbed her children, pulling them close as torches flickered in the distance. The soldiers' voices grew louder, echoing through the trees. Surround the ridge. Don't let them escape. The warrior stood, his body tense, every movement precise and silent. He looked at her once, his expression unreadable. Take them to the river, he said. Follow the water until it bends east. Don't stop until the sun rises. She grabbed his arm, her voice breaking. You'll be killed. He held her gaze. If I fall, they follow me, not you. The truth hit her like ice. He was choosing to draw them away, to sacrifice himself for their escape. No, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. We stay together. He shook his head gently. You saved my life. Now I save yours. He pressed something into her hand, the wooden bird. Keep it, he said. When you see the eagle in the morning sky, know I am near. Then without another word, he vanished into the trees, his figure swallowed by the dark. Moments later, the first shots rang out. She flinched, holding her children close, whispering prayers through her tears. The forest lit with flashes of fire as the sound of battle echoed across the valley. The widow ran, heart pounding, her children stumbling beside her as they followed the river's curve. Behind them, the world burned with noise, shouts, gunfire, the crack of branches. She didn't look back, not once, but somewhere deep inside, she knew that the fight happening behind her would decide all their fates. When they finally reached the far bank, dawn was breaking. The light touched the mountains in soft gold, and above the rising mist an eagle circled high in the sky. The widow stopped, breathless, clutching the small carving in her palm. The bird felt warm, as if it carried life within it. Her heart ached, suspended between hope and despair. She didn't know what awaited them next, or whether he still lived. But the wind that swept down from the peaks carried something faint, almost like his voice. and as the first rays of sunlight touched her face, she felt the moment before everything would change. The edge of something vast and final, waiting to break. The air was thin and cold as dawn broke fully across the valley. The widow stood on the riverbank, clutching her children to her chest, her eyes fixed on the pale sky where the eagle circled. Its cry echoed faintly through the mountains, fading into the wind. For a long moment she stood frozen, torn between grief and belief, wanting to think that somehow the warrior's spirit had kept its promise. The light grew stronger, spilling over the trees and turning the snow into gold. She took it as a sign that she had to keep going, even if every step forward meant leaving part of her heart behind. They traveled for miles along the river, following its winding path through the valley. The land was changing with the early spring thaw, patches of brown earth showing through the melting snow, the scent of pine stronger with every breeze. Her children were weary, their faces pale from the cold, but she urged them on with gentle words and quiet determination. By midday they reached a small ridge overlooking a wide clearing, where an abandoned shepherd's hut stood half buried in frost. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. For the first time in days, she let herself breathe. Inside the hut she built a fire from broken timber and wrapped her children in blankets. As the warmth returned to the room, exhaustion finally overtook her. She sat by the doorway, staring at the wooden bird still clutched in her hand. Its carved wings seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, smooth and warm from her touch. She remembered the warrior's words, "When you see the eagle in the morning sky, know I am near." She whispered to the quiet room, "Then you're still near." Days turned into weeks, and spring began to awaken the valley. The soldiers moved on eventually, chasing shadows farther west. The widow and her children slowly rebuilt a life of their own. She patched the hut's walls with bark and clay, grew small patches of greens in the soft soil, and taught her boy to fish by the river. Yet each night, as the fire dimmed and the forest went still, her thoughts drifted back to him, the Apache who had entered her world like a storm and vanished like smoke. She wondered if his body lay somewhere in those woods, if the land had claimed him as it did all who belonged to it. One afternoon, her boy came running from the woods, excitement lighting his face. "Ma, there's someone by the ridge!" Her heart lurched. She grabbed her shawl and followed him, her boots crunching over the damp earth. At the edge of the forest, she saw it, smoke rising faintly between the trees. Her first thought was fear. But as she crept closer, she saw a small campfire and beside it, a figure sitting cross-legged, wrapped in animal hide. He turned slowly at her approach, and for a heartbeat, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. It was him. The warrior's face was thinner, his eyes shadowed with weariness. But it was him. The scar on his arm, the braid down his shoulder, the quiet strength that seemed carved into his being. It was all the same. He rose slowly, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. "You made it," he said, his voice soft and rough like gravel underfoot. She couldn't find her words. Instead, she reached for him, the wooden bird still in her hand. He looked down at it and smiled faintly. "It kept you safe," he said. "I knew it would." They sat by the fire while the children gathered wildflowers nearby. He told her what had happened after that night. The soldiers had chased him into the canyons, but he knew the land better than they did. He had used the fog and cliffs to slip away, wounded but alive. He had watched from a distance for days, making sure she and the children escaped safely before heading north to find the rest of his people. But when he reached his tribe's camp, he found only ashes. The army had come before him. There was no one left. Her heart broke for him. He had lost his home, his brother, his people, and yet here he stood, alive but untethered, belonging nowhere. She touched his arm gently. "You still have us," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You gave me something no war ever did. Peace." The following months passed quietly. The widow and her children shared the small hut with the warrior. He built traps and hunted, teaching her boy how to move through the woods without sound. Her daughter followed him like a shadow, listening to his stories of rivers that sang and spirits that guarded the stars. The widow worked the land, growing stronger with each season. The valley, once filled with fear, became their refuge, but peace in that wild land never lasted forever. One afternoon, smoke appeared again in the distance, this time from settlers moving west. The widow watched from the ridge as wagons rolled through the valley, men shouting orders, axes echoing against trees. The world was changing, pushing deeper into what had once been untouched. The warrior stood beside her, silent, his expression unreadable. "They will come here too," he said. She nodded, her throat tight. "And when they do?" He looked toward the horizon, the setting sun painting his face in gold and crimson. Then we move again. The land will tell us where to go. That night, as they sat by the fire, the widow felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Fragile, but real. The life they had built wasn't perfect. It was quiet, uncertain, but it was theirs. She realized that home wasn't the cabin she had lost, or the land she worked. It was the people who shared her fire, the voices that filled her nights, the hands that kept her from falling. One evening, her son asked the warrior, "Why do you always look at the stars?" The man smiled faintly. "Because they are the same for all people. My people watch them. Yours do too. The stars remind us that no one truly owns the sky." The widow watched him as he spoke, his face illuminated by the flames. She knew then that he would never belong to one place or one people. He was a man born between worlds, one foot in the old ways, one in the new. When the first snow of the next winter fell, they prepared to leave the valley. The warrior said the mountains to the west would offer safety, and beyond them, rivers where soldiers rarely traveled. The widow packed what little they had, wrapping her daughter's hair in a ribbon and tucking the carved bird into her coat. Before they left, she stood by the river one last time, staring at the reflection of her small family in the water, the widow, her children, and the Apache who had changed everything. As they set out toward the mountains, the snow fell softly around them, covering their footprints almost as quickly as they were made. The warrior led the way, his silhouette strong against the rising wind. The boy followed close, carrying a small bow across his back, while the little girl rode in her mother's arms, humming one of his tribal songs. The widow looked up at the sky, where once again an eagle circled, high and steady, riding the wind. She smiled faintly, whispering to the cold air, "We're still here." Years later, long after the valley was filled with new settlers and the old trails were forgotten, stories spread among the mountain folk about a woman who lived deep in the western hills with her children, and a man they called the Silent One. They said he was an Apache warrior who had turned away from war to protect the family who once saved his life. Some said they'd seen him standing by the river at dawn, his long hair shining in the morning sun, watching the sky as if waiting for someone, or something. No one ever found their home. But the legend lingered, whispered around campfires on cold nights. The tale of a poor widow and her children who saved a dying Apache warrior, unaware that he would one day save them in return. And though time swallowed, their names and the world moved on, the river still carried their story. The story of mercy, courage, and love that defied both fear and fate. The wind through the pines still sang of it, soft and endless, like the voice of the valley remembering what it owed to those who once dared to show compassion in a land that had forgotten it. In that silence, their spirits lived on, bound by the same promise that began it all. She had given him life, and in return he had given her a reason to keep living.